Welcome back to the Podium Performance Podcast, where we talk about physical performance. I'm your host, Coach Tony. You can find this podcast on YouTube or on iTunes and Spotify podcasts. In the last episode, I spoke about how coordination is a physical attribute that brings everything together. The best of the best in a domain will always be the most coordinated, as it ties every other attribute together. Without it, you cannot perform well. Today, I'm going to begin an overview of our primary energy systems, of which we have three. Because this basic understanding is needed for anything discussed going forward, particularly the next topic of external influences. Without understanding the energy systems at a rudimentary level, we can't understand physical performance. Our three energy systems are as follows: the anaerobic alactic, the anaerobic lactic, aka glycolytic, and the aerobic energy systems. Each of their names describes to an extent how they utilize energy, but first we need to know what the body utilizes for energy. This is the molecule ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, and its derivatives of ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and AMP, adenosine monophosphate. But the primary is ATP. Something to keep in mind is that no system is ever the only system that is in use. It is a continuum of sorts. I'm going to attempt to keep this to the most basic important info on each system before potentially diving really deep into each of them way down the road, because to be honest, the granular aspects really aren't needed for most things and won't interest the vast majority of people. There are people who literally get doctorate degrees in various aspects of each energy system, just so you can see how deep down the rabbit hole of each you can go. But first, just take a moment. If you're looking to get some high quality protein and other supplements, head over to atblabs.com and use my code RISLING10, that's RISLING 10, for a 10% discount. That's even what I'm drinking right now, is their HP Labs grass-fed whey with their red and greens mix. Also, if you're looking to get into red light therapy, use the link below for a discount with EMR Tech. They have some of the highest quality red light therapy devices on the market that have next to zero flicker, which allows you to have the best treatment you can in terms of red light therapy. Now, back to the fun stuff. Our body makes ATP from the food that we eat, which is made up of macronutrients, which for simplicity's sake, and when talking only about energy usage, the body partitions the macronutrients that we eat into two forms of storage: glycogen and fat. Fats that we eat are first broken down into triglycerides, which are easily stored as fat in the body, while the carbs are broken down first into glucose, which is used to then replenish the glycogen stores within the body and for short-term usage, and if it's in the bloodstream, for immediate use to be sent to the muscles. The other place where we store a lot of glycogen is inside of our liver. Any excess will then be converted into fat for long-term storage. Yes, protein as well can be broken down and converted into glucose in a process called gluconeogenesis. Remember, I'm giving the simplified breakdown here, but we'll dive deeper in a later episode in the future. Glucose and triglycerides are the body's two main primary energy substrates, or fuels for simplicity, and each one has a primary use. Glucose is primarily going to be used for short-term and higher intensity demands. Think of a sprint, which requires very high intensity for a brief period of time, or lifting weights. Meanwhile, the triglycerides and fats are going to be used for long-term energy, like day-to-day life. As I stated, there are three primary energy systems to cover. Each will have a primary energy substrate that it will use with the name of it hinting at which one. Anaerobic means without oxygen metabolism, while aerobic means the use of oxygen. Anytime you're needing O2 or oxygen for energy, things are going to slow down and the intensity will be much lower than from maximal. Now you notice there are two forms of anaerobic, or one of them being lactic and the other one being alactic. Basically, one generates a considerable amount of lactate but doesn't use it for energy along with glucose, while the other one does. The anaerobic alactic system is your most maximal output energy, but it's only good for an extremely short period of time and effort. Think of throwing a fastball in baseball or a quick 20-yard sprint for cover on a battlefield, or you're doing a 1-rep max in the gym. This system mostly uses ATP-CP for adenosine triphosphate creatine phosphate, the CP part being the creatine phosphate, which is in very short and small quantities in the body and is extremely costly to use, as breaking the bond between ATP and CP, those two parts of it, releases a lot of heat and carries water with it while generating substantial amounts of lactate, which we commonly call lactic acid. It also takes the longest for the body to actually replenish. For those curious about creatine supplements and supplementation, this is what you are helping to somewhat increase the stores of by increasing the amount of creatine inside of the body so that you're fully saturated. But that is a topic for another day, which will be covered. Your anaerobic lactic system or glycolytic pathway, again, uses no oxygen for actual energy production, but what it requires is glucose to be used and broken down extremely rapidly for adenosine triphosphate, ATP, for continued energy use. Another two molecules called nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, NADH+, and pyruvate, which will come into play later. This energy demand is not efficient, and you will rapidly burn through your muscle stores of glucose quite rapidly, as each glucose molecule will only produce a few molecules of ATP, approximately only 4. So you get a big sugar molecule, and it only breaks down into about 4 molecules of ATP. You'll see how this is tiny in comparison to the aerobic pathway shortly. This system, just like the first anaerobic system, generates substantial amounts of lactate and because the energy demand is so high, it is breaking ATP down into ADP rapidly, which causes the release of the phosphate. So ATP, that adenosine triphosphate, so each adenosine molecule has 3 phosphates onto it. That's the triphosphate. When you break one of them off, it now becomes diphosphate. And then when you break 2 of them off, it's monophosphate. Just think of it that way. You got one, it normally has 3 on there for best energy usage. You cut one of them off, now it's no longer ATP, it's ADP. And whenever you cleave off one of these phosphate molecules from the ATP, you also release a hydrogen ion. The combination of the hydrogen ions and the lactate accumulation in the muscle and blood causes the body's pH, the scale measure of how acidic or alkaline that something is, to slightly lower, making it ever so slightly more acidic, which, because we as humans are so incredibly sensitive to these changes than you might actually think, this is where you get that burning sensation, that my muscles are on fire feeling from. Our body fluctuates by less than a 1 on the scale, and the scale goes from 1 to 14. Our bodies are relatively close to 7, which is what water is, fairly neutral on the scale. If we go too far in either direction, that's the end of us, we no longer live. So this process, your actual pH levels in the blood will only fluctuate by 0.1 to 0.2 at most. That's how finely regulated our body is. But yet, just that tiny little difference, we feel it, and it can be almost excruciating when taken to the extremes. But when are you going to use this energy system? Well, if you're an avid gym goer or bodybuilder that enjoys lifting weights, or you're simply just an athlete, this is the energy system you're going to be living in during training. This is the system that will have you breathing deeper than you're comfortable with and cause you to become nauseous, even bring you to throw up. If you've never truly pushed your limits and gotten to that point, I challenge you to do it just once, just to experience it. The weird thing is, the moment you let it out, you finally spew, you'll have this weird dopamine rush and almost like a euphoric feeling afterwards. You'll almost feel good, for lack of a better way of putting it, once you've tossed your chunks. At this point, I'd like to make a simple statement. Carbohydrates are the macronutrient of high performance. Those that claim otherwise and that you don't need carbs to perform at a high level are wrong. For general health, they are not needed, especially in the quantities that we as a society consume. And this excess has led to a massive increase in both obesity rates as well as type 2 diabetes mellitus rates. We can get into our aerobic energy system. This is the energy system that we use the most overall in life, and it is what I like to also call the recovery energy system. As the name suggests, it requires oxygen in order for it to work. Without it, again, we die. There's a very thin line between whether the aerobic or glycolytic system will be the primary driver. This is what is called the lactate threshold. The point where the intensity or the demands of energy is so high that you have to now get into using glycolysis to get ATP made fast enough. Because the aerobic system is relatively slow in comparison, at a certain intensity level, it just can't keep up. And you need to kind of turn up the furnace in a way and get things moving a little bit faster. Many people have also heard that the VO2 max, the volume of oxygen consumed, is critical for endurance sports, and that is very true. This is the most oxygen measured in milliliters per kilogram, measured in liters per kilogram per minute used. So basically, it's the most amount of oxygen that your body is going to be able to use in aerobic metabolism to keep up with the energy demands. Above that amount, you're now going into glycolysis. So very high level aerobic athletes also have very high VO2 maxes. The other great thing about having a better VO2 max is that it will allow you to recover better, and the relative intensity before you start to get into using your anaerobic system is a little bit higher, which means you're now going to be able to stay at a higher intensity for a little bit longer. The biggest difference between energy systems is what the fuel source is. For glycolysis, the primary fuel was glucose, while for aerobic, it is lipids, particularly the fatty acids in the triglycerides. Each of these molecules, as the name suggests, is 3 fatty acids bound by glycerol. So you have glycerol that's got 3 fatty acid chains basically attached to it. The longer each of those fatty acid chains is, the more energy potential that it has. So long chain fatty acids have much more energy potential to them than medium and short chain fatty acids. Well, I said before that glycolysis gets you roughly 4 ATP molecules. Each fatty acid in aerobic metabolism in your aerobic system can get you more than 10 times that. It just takes longer. One of the other amazing aspects of the aerobic system, and why I say it's the recovery system, is that it can take the NADH, the nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, from the glycolytic pathway and use it as a fuel source to get additional ATP molecules produced in what is called the electron transport chain. And also, it can take the pyruvate from that first part of glycolysis, sends it to the liver, and it goes through the Cori cycle, which again, now you get more ATP being produced into the body, and it can then also take that and start to make more glucose. Okay, enough of the nerdy physiology stuff like this, as this is just going to be about the basics. Your aerobic system, as it is taxed and more oxygen is required, is what causes you to breathe more rapidly during exercise, or even when stressed, like an exam or hard mental tasks, or when you're panicking a little bit. Along with it comes a steady rise in heart rate and the force at which your heart contracts with to pump blood. And this is to bring oxygen not just to your muscles, but also to that noodle in your head, your brain. When you are sticking to primarily using your aerobic system, you'll get the heart rate to elevate, then settle back into a rhythm once the body automatically senses what it really needs and what the intensity is going to be. Now, if the intensity is too high for too long, your heart rate will remain elevated, and it will stay elevated until which point you have recovered, you've caught your breath, and it's able to come back down commensurately with that. And it's now been able to also replenish ATP stores in the muscles, in your brain, as well as get byproducts in your blood, in your blood vessels, in your veins, in your arteries, to be removed. Whether that's the pyruvate, bringing that through, bringing the nicotinamide, the NADH, or removing carbon dioxide from the blood. Places you see this system in use at the highest level is definitely going to be long distance events like marathon races, Ironmans. But another place you might not think so much is, think about a surgeon doing one of those 10-hour surgeries. Their brain needs to be fueled the entire time. They have to be turned on and completely focused for that entire duration. Or even think of your favorite musician playing in concert. They've got to be able to perform at that level for a long period of time. That's going to require fairly healthy aerobic system. Now that I've gone over the basics of the 3 primary energy systems, we can start to get into physical performance with the next episode, and I will be going up into the sky with this one. We're going to be going high, discussing how elevation and altitude will influence performance. Whether that's playing basketball in Denver, you're running a marathon up in Nairobi, or we're going up even higher, dealing with pilots and astronauts. How it can be good for some sports, harder for others, and how altitude and elevation can be downright deadly. Look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Coach Tony, Wrestling Podium Performance. Embrace your potential.